Okay, I hope you can see me online as well. Yeah, thanks, Julia, for the really kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this workshop. Like, I'm really super excited and really honored to be presenting next to like all the amazing speakers, some of whose papers like got me into the field of event-based cameras like almost 6 years ago now. So it's really like a nice opportunity for me. So as Julia mentioned, like I'm a final year PhD student at TU Berlin. And over the past few years, I've been exploring various aspects of motion and scene perception with event-based cameras with like a variety of projects. As Julia mentioned, my first foray into event-based cameras was trying to understand how we can incorporate depth in visual attention for the humanoid robot ICUP at IIT. And then I continued working on other problems during my PhD, like trying to detect when an object is going to slip from a gripper while it is being manipulated under high acceleration, for example. And then also I did some work with collaborating with ecologists where we tracked penguin behavior remotely in Antarctica, trying to identify their behavior for like low power remote applications. And finally, the focus of this current talk is going to be on stereo depth estimation and SLAM, which is my main topic during my PhD that I focused on. So I'm going to mostly be talking about how we can estimate depth using stereo event-based cameras and also ego motion. Um, so we recently published a survey paper on this topic, and which kind of tries to comprehensively track how the field progressed since the inception of event-based cameras. So it includes quite a bit of comparison and benchmarking of different classes of methods, both like learning-based and model-based methods. And also like we reviewed like the existing event-based stereo datasets in the context of how they are useful for benchmarking and also for learning using data, right? So we hope this will serve as a useful resource for people who are willing, like who want to join the community, and also for like a good handbook for experts who are already in the field. So we observed that many methods in stereo depth estimation focus on the problem of instantaneous depth estimation, which is really the case where it's advantageous for detecting really fast dynamic scenes. So for example, in this scene, we don't really understand what's happening when it's played in real time, but as we slow down, we see that it's basically a hand catching a cube, right? So this is a very fast and dynamic scene. And event cameras can resolve the depth of this kind of dynamic scene because of its very high temporal resolution. And the key idea here is that because of the fact that events are produced at a very high temporal resolution, the same 3D edge will produce events at the same time in the left and the right cameras. So we can use additional cues like the spike timing of both of events in both the cameras, in addition to epipolar geometry and things like how similar the motion looks in both the cameras to do depth estimation more accurately and in a fast manner. However, note that this kind of motion is really complex to model by itself. So it requires us to process like the input and the output independently in time. So we're kind of using just the events at that instant to estimate the depth at the current instant. And then we have methods that process events over longer periods of time. For example, like this driving scene, which includes a lot of stationary background. So in case of this quasi-stationary scenes, uh, using camera motion information to aggregate information over a long time can really help us get more accurate depth information. So how can we fuse information over longer periods of time? So the most obvious approach is probably by first estimating the depth at each time instance and then fusing it down the line, right? Using known camera motion. However, so this is the approach that ESVO, for example, which is a really like popular visual stereometry paper from 2021 uses. However, another approach that I followed mostly during my PhD is trying to build intermediate representations from events and fuse them early in the pipeline. So as you can see in this figure, like we use events from the left and right cameras and convert them into this intermediate representation called DSIs or disparity space images using also known camera motion. And then we fuse this information. So these DSIs are generated by back projecting events using the known camera motion as rays. And then these ray densities are fused across multiple cameras before extracting depth using local maxima. The good thing here is that because we are doing this fusion operation, instead of doing pairwise stereo correspondence, we don't need to explicitly solve the problem of trying to find the match between the left and the right event, which is highly difficult because events are noisy and they don't contain enough information as it in itself, as Luna just suggested. So let's take a deeper dive into like how this multi-camera method works. Let me just hide this. Yeah. So here we see input data from, oops, sorry. Yeah. So here we see input data from the left and the right event cameras showing this scene looking at a desktop, which are then back projected using the known camera poses to form these disparity space images that I was talking about. And you see that the rays from the left and the right camera both form their own individual DSIs, which are then fused into a single DSI using element-wise operations like harmonic mean. So sweeping across the depth axis, we see that the edge features come into focus only at the correct depth plane. So each voxel represents the probability of there existing a 3D edge in the scene. The depth and its confidence can be extracted from each pixel using local maxima. And then we can finally obtain a point cloud of the scene. So this is quite a simple operation. So here are some results. We tested MCMVS, which is the method I presented, on multiple data sets. And in this case, this is a data set with stereo HD event cameras mounted on like an egocentric data set mounted on a head of a person moving around in a scene. So this is a biking sequence where we don't have ground truth pose information, but we get pose information from an offline visual inertial odometry pipeline. And in this case, we see that even with noisy poses because of imperfect pose estimation, we can recover cars, trees, and buildings quite well. And we can see that MCMBS works well with even high resolution cameras, and it works well with low resolution cameras as well. So so we used the depth extracted from MCMVS and extended this into a direct visual odometry method. So in this visual odometry method, our stereo pipeline comprises two parallelly running mapping and tracking modules communicating to each other via 6 degree of freedom camera poses and local point clouds. So the mapper builds on our previous work, as I just suggested. And the output point cloud that we get from the mapper are actually quite sharp and doesn't contain any blur, which is actually useful for our tracker because then we can estimate incremental camera pose by simply minimizing the photometric edge alignment error between the projection of the point cloud and the raw binary events projected on an image plane. So this becomes a simple edge alignment problem. And we can see that this method can run real time with stereo Davis cameras. And we presented this demo last year at ECCV. And here in the panels, you can see these are the raw events. And this is an RViz visualization with the point cloud of the scene projected in color, the local point cloud, and the global point cloud, which is a concatenated version of these local point clouds. And here are the projections of the depth map and the confidence map. So another interesting thing about the fusion strategy that we use is that it allows us to efficiently fuse data with multiple cameras, like more than 2 cameras. And this allows us to test it on this trinocular data set, EVIMO2, where we generate maps using all the 3 cameras, but we only track the central camera in this case. So we also show results from this long driving sequences of the DSEC dataset recorded with VGA resolution cameras. So this is an excerpt from a driving scene driving around in Zurich. So you see that the local point clouds again are showed in color, and they are concatenated to produce the global point cloud showed here in gray. So here is a global view of the final trajectory and the point cloud of the street. You can see that the method works quite well without having a refinement step of bundle adjustment. So this is just a front end. So we see that DSIs are quite powerful representations, and they contain a lot of rich information about the kind of depth and 3D structure in the scene, but also the kind of motion that the camera underwent while going around in the scene, right? So essentially what we are doing in estimating depth from DSI is we are back projecting arrays through space, through the events, and we are finding out where these rays intersect within 3D space using the global consensus, right? So how do we estimate depth from these DSIs, right? So in our previous work, MCMVS, what we did was we used a heuristic where we counted the number of rays that passed through each voxel, right? So this is basically counting the number of rays that passing through this voxel and using the local maxima along all these depth layers to identify which depth is the correct depth. But this has some problems, right? Because our space is discretized, so a number of rays might pass through them also around neighboring voxels. And also the fact that there are spurious intersections like here and here would kind of lead to erroneous outputs. So then the point is, how can we do better than just using this heuristic of extracting local maxima, right? So we thought, why not try to learn this function? Why not try to learn whether we can estimate depth from DSIs? So this is following like recent trend also in event-based vision, where we see a lot of data-driven methods. And am I good on time? Okay. Okay. But instead of relying on end-to-end learning from events, what we focus on is learning from intermediate representations called DSIs. So what we have here is input events. We then do the same back projection with the camera poses. And then we have a network that learns to predict depth from DSIs. But the key difference here is instead of trying to learn depth for the entire DSI, we break the problem into individual sub-DSI, like learning the depth from individual sub-DSI. So we're looking at a narrow column where we're trying to identify which voxel or which depth layer corresponds to a ray intersection. So this leads to a semi-dense depth map, as we see here. And it also allows us to have a very lightweight model with low latency that can be used, for example, in a real-time SLAM system. The key idea here is that we only learn from sub-DSIs that have enough events. So we use the sparsity of the DSI. So this is a scene from the MVSEC dataset with a drone flying indoors. The panels here show the events. This is the confidence map. This is the MCEMVS output that I presented at the beginning. And this is the output of the learned method, DIRDNet. This is the ground truth from the LiDAR, and this is the ground truth that is masked using the pixels where there are events. So we can see that it achieves quite remarkable results, and we get much better depth accuracy compared to other multiview stereo methods. And actually, even the molecular version of this outperforms similar stereo methods. And another interesting thing is that because we explicitly introduce the camera motion as a prior to our method, it achieves better or sometimes comparable performance to other end-to-end learning-based methods, but with a much lower computational overhead. So to conclude, I can say that including camera motion information where you can really improves the accuracy of your depth estimation, especially for like quasi-stationary scenes. And DSIs are really powerful intermediate geometric representations that do not require any pairwise stereo matching. And we can extract really blur-free sharp depth maps from them using like local maxima, which can be used for edge alignment for tracking. And using a deep neural network to replace this local maxima can further improve performance as we see. But one important thing is that we are able to use the sparsity of the DSI to produce a really lightweight and robust estimation. We can talk about this more detail later offline. So just some idea of like moving forward. I think we will see more developments in the direction of on-device processing, as Mina mentioned, with like especially with HD event cameras, we need to reduce the bandwidth in some sense. We see a lot of foundation models for computer like frame-based vision methods. So we could see similar trends in event-based vision, but the problem is like lack of annotated ground truth depth. And we could use a lot of unsupervised methods and synthetic data and multimodal approaches for this. Nighttime perception is another problem due to blinking lights and high noise and also highly dynamic environments, which is a big problem for SLAM. Finally, active mapping is another big field that could see a big improvement with event-based vision, where you also control the camera motion besides perception. And finally, we need better benchmarking, mostly for independently moving objects, and also like maybe more asynchronous evaluations. Yeah, and so finally, like these are kind of the works I presented. And to conclude, I just want to thank all my collaborators and the members of the TU Berlin Robotic Interactive Perception Lab, especially my supervisor, Guillermo. And with that, I end my talk.
Okay, do we have questions in the meantime?